Thank you for listening to the P-Pod from the Somerset Safeguarding Children Partnership. Due to the nature of this podcast, themes relating to the abuse and neglect of children are discussed. Therefore, listener discretion is advised and the content unsuitable for children.
Welcome to the P-Pod.
Right then, welcome back once again to the P-Pod, the partnership podcast from the Somerset Safeguarding Children Partnership. My name is Steve Macabee and I'm the multi-agency training manager for the partnership. And today I'm really pleased to be joined by a very special guest for us who actually is possibly sick of me by now, because we had our forum week recently of a series of webinars throughout the week on the subject of serious youth violence and exploitation. And our guest very, very kindly came along to that week to share her expertise with us, and even kinder from that, then agreed to do a follow-up podcast episode with us. And I'm so pleased today to be joined by Lin Sands from the NWG, the National Working Group, who focused on the subject of modern slavery and exploitation of children and young people. So Lin, thank you so much for joining us along today. It's great to have you back with us.
Thank you very much, Steve. I'm very pleased to be here.
So to get into this, I'm sure many people have heard of the NWG, or at the very least, a number of the big national campaigns that you run around exploitation. But for those people who haven't heard of the NWG before, are you able to give a bit of an overview about what the NWG's mission is and how it supports professionals working with children and young people?
Yeah, of course. So the NWG, which stands for the National Working Group, we're a networking, not-for-profit charitable organisation, mostly membership driven. We have a membership that spans many countries outside of England and Wales and Scotland, Ireland, Southern Ireland. We also have memberships from other English-speaking countries outside of the United Kingdom and Southern Ireland. We are, as I say, primarily we are a networking organisation, and we pride ourselves on the fact that we have an incredible reach in terms of the diversity of partners, practitioners, people that are tackling the exploitation of children and young adults, and who want to know that they've got support from each other, that they've got a critical friend that they can go to, a bit of a sounding board really in terms of their progress of their own practice, what they can do to improve it. And whilst we are about networking and bringing people together that have similar wants, if you like, in terms of improving services, improving responses, we're also an organisation where we gather resources and any forms, any research, anything that people have done in terms of assessment frameworks, tried and tested, where they want to use us as a platform to share that good news and that progression of that practice. We are there for that as well. So we encourage people to share practice, that's things that are working particularly well, and where they want other people to hear about it. And whilst we do have our own campaigns, the Say Something If You See Something campaign that was nearly 11 years ago, which informed Operation Makepeace, which has now become a really big element of the way that we deal with exploitation across the country, particularly from a policing perspective. We also support local campaigns and individual campaigns. So again, we give them a voice. We give them that opportunity to share what's going on, to make sure that everyone can really benefit from the amazing work that's going on out there. And we know that resources are becoming fewer, the demands are becoming higher. So the more that we can do to support those individuals who are already facing quite a difficult task of keeping up with the flow of this, we do our best to support them as much as we possibly can.
And I know you do so much work right the way across the country. And I know you work with lots of partner agencies as well, don't you? And
yes,
we were talking just before recording this about sort of a number of those that you work with. Are you able to kind of name some of the organisations you work with on a regular basis?
Yeah, we work very frequently with the Lucy Faithfull Foundation. We work with Mary Collins. But I mean, Mary Collins are doing some amazing work at the moment around online harm. The resources that they have and that they can share, we're working actively together to make sure, again, that we're sharing that really good work. The work that Lucy Faithfull Foundation does around supporting and understanding perpetrator behaviour, because there's little point in thinking about tackling exploitation if we don't actively work and gain knowledge and understanding and make sure we share that knowledge and understanding of the way that perpetrators operate around grooming and exploitation. We work with the Children's Society. We do some collaborative work with them and Bernardo's. So throughout the 3 years that I've been with the organisation, we've worked collaboratively with those particular independent charities, but we also support smaller charities, of which there are many. And certainly from a policing perspective, we work with Hydrant, we work with the College of Policing around, again, making sure that we can be as helpful as we can be in terms of sharing that knowledge, that experience, but also for us to be able to disseminate that as well, to make sure that that's accurate.
So I know you work with so many partners, probably way too many to list here today. But and it's great, like you say, it is about getting that reach and tapping into good practice. I'm a great believer, and I believe you are as well, of not reinventing the wheel.
No.
And I think we do that so often, don't we? But actually, there's a lot to learn from each other from that. And I think that role you can play in sort of acting as that glue to kind of bind all those bits together and link people together is crucial, isn't it?
And those local networks are really important. So within the team itself, we've got 11 direct, kind of what we call direct delivery leads. And all of those leads will have their own networks and their own connections and experiences with local charities, national charities, individual authorities. And again, it's difficult, even as a team where we regularly meet, we regularly share what we're doing. There's just so many. I think at the last count, it was something like 25,500 memberships at different times that we've had, and associations. So it is massive. And that's one of our, probably, I would say, one of the very unique selling points, if you want, in terms of NWG, is our reach is extensive and largely born out of the amazing relationships that Sheila, our CEO, developed and has built and continues to build within the organisation. Yeah.
No, and I know you do a lot of work as well with, and you mentioned policing, but yeah, I know you do a lot of work with police forces around the country. You do a lot of work with local authorities. Obviously, we've been working over the last year or so with the NWG in Somerset, following our JTI inspection. And how do you? What's that work with broadly across different local authorities? What does that look like in terms of the work that you do and those community partners that you build up, and to kind of ensure that really good coordinated safeguarding response when we've got concerns around exploitation?
It does vary, as I say, from each individual within the team. They have a particular focus. So many people listening to this, I'm sure, will have either met or heard of Steve Bagley, who's been with the team, probably one of the longest members of the team, and Kev as well. Kev Murphy. And Steve's particular role has been to really put transitional safeguarding on the map in terms of really understanding that when children are being exploited, just because they turn 18 doesn't mean the exploitation stops. And there is a lot to do in terms of, again, informing practice and supporting those practitioners that are working with youngsters post 18. And so his focus has been very much around that national platform, talking about transitional safeguarding from a contextual perspective. And one of our team members, Maria, is doing lots of work around supporting families and empowering families to become more knowledgeable and more confident to ask the questions that they need to ask. And, when they feel that they are perhaps not being involved within those conversations as much as they should be, how they might address that in a really helpful way, rather than being seen as obstructive, or that that they don't want to get involved. From my perspective, I would say that because I'm the police and justice lead, but I've also been doing the training role for the last 12 months as well. So I've had to kind of juggle both. But a lot of the work that I've been doing has been focused around helping partners to really understand, when we talk about interrupting and disrupting exploitation, how important it is that it is seen as a partner responsibility, not just down to the police. And the police are no different to any other partner, in as much that they are stretched in terms of their resources. Sometimes they don't have the knowledge, if they haven't got that particular expertise, or if they're new in a team, new in the service itself. So a lot of the work that I've been doing is to empower and enable all of the partners to recognize that they have a responsibility, and not just to look at that poor police officers sitting in that room, expecting them to know everything, and that, asking, what can we do together? And if we don't have enough information, if we don't have the evidence, how are we going to find it? How are we going to get it? So that's about that work that I've been particularly involved in.
And that's so crucial, isn't it? I think there's always a risk around things where people say, well, that's a social worker's job. Or, that's a police officer's job. And like you say, actually, it's particularly around exploitation, which is tricky. It takes so many different forms. And I think that's evolving more and more, isn't it? As we sort of see technologically assisted kind of abuse taking place more and more.
Yeah.
Actually, it's so important to come together and say, actually, we need to tackle this together. You can't tackle it in isolation at all. And again, joining up those dots, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I'm just thinking, obviously within your role and the role of the NWG, you see things sort of evolving all the time and changing all the time. And I know, again, when just looking at child criminal exploitation, it's a constantly sort of shifting sand of exploitation that takes place, different models and things like that. And what would you say from what you see nationally? What are some of those kind of most pressing sort of challenges facing professionals in safeguarding roles?
I think certainly the use of technology to abuse children, we've seen with the Internet Watch Foundation. We've been working closely with them to look at the ways that the new Online Safety Act has been implemented and how that's going to be governed, how that's going to be policed, if you like. So we've absolutely seen a massive change in not just the number of children that are being sexually exploited online, and then that leading on to other forms of exploitation, because it's not solely sexual. It can lead on to all kinds of exploitation. But we've really seen a shift in the kind of stereotypical male subject to CE, criminal exploitation, girls sexually exploited. And I mentioned, I think, at the forum that I attended, that from the Internet Watch Foundation, 91% of children who are sharing images, perhaps consensually in the first instance, where those images are then being used against them to extort money or to groom them into other forms of exploitation. 91% male adolescents. That's the largest number in terms of that sort of group of individuals who are being extorted. And that really flies in the face of when we think about sexual exploitation in that form, we generally think of girls, but actually young adolescent boys are hugely at risk of this form of exploitation. But I guess as well, around sexual exploitation, there's been a lot of focus on county lines and gangs and criminal exploitation. And we are waiting for the Crime and Policing Bill to become an act which will bring a specific criminal offence of criminal exploitation of children. But alongside that, somehow the sexual exploitation conversation has kind of drifted off a little bit. And there is absolutely no way that it's disappeared, that we've got on top of it and that we've kind of solved it. It seems to have just faded a little bit into the background. And before the headlines hit around the most recent grooming gang, the group that were convicted in the northwest of the country, we as an organisation were already hearing those kind of rumblings about why we're not talking about it. Why is it not being talked about at the moment? So we've got a conference coming up in the early autumn, which will be focusing on sexual exploitation and asking the question, where is it? What are we doing in response to it? Because it's never gone away. It's there. I think there's a lot of links to what is seen to be most pressing at that moment, where we're going to focus the resources. And that's understandable from all elements, from all statutory and non-statutory positions, that's going to happen. But the sexual exploitation angle is something that is definitely coming to the fore again. And we're seeing the change in legislation, but we're also seeing changes in the curiosity, the questions. Again, that kind of links in with what you're asking in terms of change, in as much that what we are really starting to recognize, and we know our partners are really recognizing, is that when we see a child or a young adult who's being exploited in one particular way, we shouldn't ignore the fact that the likelihood is that there are other forms of exploitation going on as well, but they're perhaps not either able to talk about it, or the curiosity isn't there. So they're not given an opportunity maybe to talk about it. And there've been, in my own experience, lots of examples of where practitioners have come to talk to us about tricky cases and asking us as a critical friend where they might go with it. Where we've asked that question, have you considered there may be other forms of exploitation happening? And it is about encouraging that curiosity. Don't just assume that when it's one type of exploitation that we suspect, that that's the only type. So we are certainly hearing of multiple forms of exploitation occurring as a means of control, as a means of instilling that fear and manipulation.
It's interesting you say that, actually. And locally within Somerset, as a business unit, we did a bit of a review of an old serious case review in the old format, which focused around child sex exploitation. And I think it's really interesting being part of that, because one of the quite a strong feeling that came out from sort of some feedback groups we did around that was that there's potentially a risk where over time, I think, we start lumping everything in as exploitation, as one thing. And I think there's quite a concern in the room, because I know obviously, initially we started talking about child sexual exploitation, going back to Rotherham, Rochdale, all those reviews. And then it was more recently, still not that long ago, more recently, we started to become aware of county lines and grooming gangs and criminal exploitation a lot more. And I think one feeling that came out is that over time, we've sort of lumped them together as either CE or just under the banner of exploitation.
Yeah.
And there's a risk within that quite often when we think about CE, quite often what we're thinking about is criminal exploitation. And I think possibly, we do need to recognize that if there's criminal exploitation taking place, quite often there can be sexual exploitation as well.
Yes.
But within that, we run a risk of losing the focus on sexual exploitation and the understanding that child sexual exploitation can take place completely independently of criminal exploitation.
Yes.
And I think somebody from the police actually vocalized it quite well. And they said, look, the way that I am responding to a victim of child criminal exploitation, where there's been sexual exploitation as well, they may have been a perpetrator as well as a victim, that's actually probably a very different conversation that I'm going to have to somebody who is a victim of rape.
Yes.
And I thought that's a really important point to make, isn't it? That we can lose sight of things, and it's always a risk. And we know as a safeguarding trend nationally over time, there's a risk we shift our focus from one thing to the next. And I know, initially when child sexual exploitation first started really being talked about nationally following Rotherham back in 2013, there's a huge shift to focusing on child sexual exploitation. And then over time, we suddenly saw this rise in case reviews where there was interfamilial sexual abuse. And so we shift our focus from one to the next, but it's so important to keep that broad perspective, isn't it, of all forms of abuse, and not take our eye off the ball in terms of one or the other.
Not at all. And I think that's why for supervision training is so important. And yet I know, and I'm sure you know, Steve, that those are the two things that are the first to go. When the workforce is under pressure, supervision gets cancelled, or it becomes case allocation more than checking in on, knowledge, confidence, skills and things like that. Training. I've been a trainer for years, and the numbers start to go down. They start to decline, and it's like the practitioners need that. Anyone that's in this line of work must be kept up to date and must have opportunities for that training to keep their knowledge fresh, up to date. Because the thing is, I know as practitioners that we get into a way of doing something, and it's only when we go to training that we kind of stop and have a chance to reflect on that and think, actually, maybe I could try it a different way. And so one of the things that we also offer as an organisation is an opportunity to review and to reflect on cases. We offer surgeries on a Tuesday morning, and it might be a case that those practitioners have been working on for some time, but they feel like they're going round and round in a circle. And just a fresh sort of pair of eyes, or set of eyes in our case, to have a look at it. And it's, you can see them almost thinking, well, why didn't I see that? Why didn't I think about that? But it's easy to assume that you not assume it. I think it's when you're within a particular when you're working with a particular case and you're so entrenched in it that it's like the old adage, isn't it? You can't see the wood for the trees, and just having that independent viewpoint can really help you to just step back a little bit. And again, that's the training that we offer as well. Is it's not trying to teach people to suck eggs. It is about saying, just keep your knowledge and your ideas and your views open and fresh, so that you feel more confident, more competent in your role, but more confident to challenge and, well, I like to use the word educate rather than challenge, to educate each other, because we all, no matter how long we've been doing our work, there is always room for learning, room for improvement. And for me, every single day is a school day. I learn something new every single day. And I think that perspective is really important for us all, really.
No, I couldn't agree more, and it's completely my ethos as well. And I think you're right. I always think in terms of training, yes, there's value in information that you're being given, but for me personally, I think the bit I always really benefit, like you say, is just that space to pick yourself up, put you in a completely, sort of different environment, and just allow yourself, or be allowed that space to reflect on what's being talked about. And I think every time I've been to any sort of training event, I have a moment where I suddenly sit there and think, oh, hang on, actually, yeah. And you can then make those connections in terms of the work that you do on a daily basis. Because like I say, when you're entrenched in it day to day, and you're dealing with crisis, and you're dealing with emotions and people and situations, it's so hard to sometimes just to step out from that for a minute and
absolutely,
have that ability just to reflect, which is so key, isn't it?
Just to see things from a slightly different perspective as well, because when you think about the term modern slavery, exploitation, you as a practitioner might assume that everybody knows what you're talking about, that you're all actually coming from the same perspective, the same level of knowledge. But I've been in situations many times where, I've been using language that might be considered to be quite victim blaming or offender minimizing. I've been sitting in a strategy meeting where I've heard partners say, "Oh, he's been missing, but he's always at his girlfriend's house," and then the conversation will go on. So, but his girlfriend's tenancy, and it's like, well, hang on a minute. This is a 15-year-old boy. How old is the girlfriend? So I've asked the question, how old? In my previous role as an advocate, how old is this girlfriend? And then they're kind of, oh, she's 35, and it's like,
hang on.
It's that tumbleweed moment. And this is not about me blaming those practitioners or criticizing them. It is just that one moment to say, hang on, what are you talking about here? Let's just rewind a bit and think about this. So that kind of, if you like, critical friend that we offer within our organization, it's not that we have a magic wand. It's just the fact that we're not entrenched. We're able to just have that outside perspective that can be so helpful to partners.
I remember you making me think about a conversation I had with somebody a while back. It was about a boy, I think he was 13 off the top of my head, and he was missing, and we were massively concerned about the fact that he was missing. And I remember having a conversation with somebody, and somebody said, "Oh, he'll be fine. He's really streetwise. He always goes missing, so he'll be okay." And I was just like, oh my God, hang on. Let's just stop and just think about what you've just said here for a minute. That actually he's more safe because he's always missing, and we don't know where he is. Is that what we're saying here? But like you say, you get into those ways of thinking, don't you? And it's hard to step out from that sometimes.
And it's hard sometimes for statutory and non-statutory partners. It doesn't matter who you are. It's hard sometimes to have that moment of, hang on a minute, what are we saying here? It is really difficult, and I really understand that. So the more that we can empower any of the partners to feel able to actually ask those questions, that is part of our goal, if you like, is if we're going to tackle exploitation, we can't just do it from one perspective. It has to come from all points to enable and empower people to be able to ask those questions and to help us take stock, step back, just have a think about it for a moment. And language, we're seeing a huge amount of work going on at the moment around language. And from my perspective, I see it within police forces, again, because of the links that I've got. We've done some work with His Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary, and we do some pre-inspection events, and we've done some post-inspection events. And a number of inspections, particularly around child protection inspections, have really highlighted the use of language in it being victim blaming, offender minimizing. And not only what that does in terms of the impact on the individual who's trying to report or who has reported exploitation and abuse, but also about the impact it has on the response as well. And I did some really, really helpful and interesting work with a Detective Chief Inspector Matt Hogg from the Metropolitan Police, and they had an inspection and a re-inspection of their child protection processes, and as I'm sure you're aware, highly criticised, particularly around language. So they've set up a working group, which I'm a part of, to look at how they can really inform and empower their staff to really recognise what impact their language has on both the survivor, the victim, and also the response. And it was interesting, he shared a live case study of a 15-year-old who was regularly going missing from residential establishments. And it was almost that rubber stamp. And I'm sure you've heard this, regular misper, you might as well just have a...
Putting themselves at risk.
Yeah, putting themselves at risk. Suspects CCE, CSE, but she doesn't come to any harm. And it's like, there's a contract.
Okay. Yeah.
So he shared this particular case example, which they looked at it, they went back, they spoke to the officers that were involved, they spoke to the staff at the most recent residential establishment, and they discovered that the staff had registration numbers of vehicles that were coming to pick her up from the place before she'd go missing. She'd returned with injuries. She had made various reports of different things, but the police at the time had said they couldn't take that further because she wasn't reporting. I mean, there were lots of issues. So they rewrote, they gave some advice and they did some training. And as a result, the very next time that she went missing, the report was very different. This is a 15-year-old child, high risk of being sexually abused, rather than CSE, CCE, actually using the words, that are so powerful. And on that occasion, when she went missing, they actually found her at the second address that the police had been given, and they arrested 3 men that were there. She was intoxicated. She was safeguarded. And as I said, this is not a criticism of the police or any of the partners, but it really highlighted for me how just use of language, not only the impact it has on the individual themselves, but the impact it has on the response. And we've been, as an organisation, we've been doing a lot of work around multi-agency exploitation meetings. The key things they really highlighted was the use of language and the response then from that use of language, and the lack of conversations around disruption. And why were they not having those conversations? Again, lack of knowledge, confidence, not wanting to upset the apple cart, all of those things. And when you look at just those 2 aspects of language and response, they are so intrinsically linked, and yet they may not be seen as so important, but they are hugely important.
Absolutely crucial. Crucial. And it's something I talk about quite often actually on these podcasts, the importance of language. And, it is, I think it is improving constantly. Yeah. But I still think there's a long way to go. There are some things that I say which horrify people. I say intentionally, but actually it wasn't that long ago we'd be talking about things like, this young person is highly promiscuous, often intoxicated, putting themselves at risk, potentially taking part in child prostitution, all those kind of horrible, horrible phrases. It wasn't that long ago we were talking about it. And people can look at that and say, well, we don't say that now. Hopefully we don't. But actually, like you say, it becomes more nuanced, more subtle sometimes when we talk about these things, and people can say, but they are putting themselves at risk. Well, they are in situations where they are very vulnerable to being abused, and like you say, actually, it's so important because even those small nuances can affect the response that we give very, very differently. And and in terms of who we put the responsibility onto.
Yeah.
If we're saying that somebody is frequently intoxicated and promiscuous, actually we're very strongly putting the responsibility onto a child.
Absolutely. And even things like not engaging. Again, I had an example I regularly share. A lad he had a gun held to his head every single day that he was exploited by a gang. And he was shown video footage and photographs of his mum going to work. She was a nurse, his dad getting in the car, his brother going to school. And he was threatened and told, "We're watching you. If you speak to a social worker, if you speak to anyone, we'll know. And we're going to," I think he was threatened with his mother being abducted and raped. And so a 16-year-old to be threatened with, even an over 18-year-old being threatened with something like that, they're not going to freely sit down and have a chat with a social worker or a police officer. And those are the two key professionals that generally will be the ones that will be trying to help and try to support that person going through that. But they may not be the best people. And in fact, in that particular case, it was the family GP that he opened up to and he spoke to because he could go to the surgery legitimately, didn't feel that, and he was unwell. So he was legitimately going to the surgery for treatment. And whilst he was there, he spoke to the doctor. And again, it just reminds us, so important that all partners recognize their role that they have in supporting, in interrupting, disrupting exploitation. They could be the playground supervisor at school. They could be the A&E nurse, the family GP. It doesn't have to be a police officer, a social worker. It could be anyone. And certainly that is the perspective that I've very much taken with our updated digital toolkit that's been around since about 2019, but we are updating and changing it to make it more user-friendly, more straightforward. So if you're the A&E nurse, if you're the playground supervisor, you don't have to be an expert in exploitation. There is a place that you can go to get some knowledge in a way that will be straightforward to understand. And that's what I wanted the toolkit to be. I didn't want it to be focused on just the statutory agencies. I wanted it to be user-friendly and understandable, using understandable language. So it's so important because they're the people that kids will often talk to, not necessarily the social worker or the police officer.
I know, now you've mentioned it. So I know you've been really, really busy since our forum week and beforehand on the digital toolkit. So you've been doing a lot of work to update. You able to elaborate on that a little bit, sort of what is in and how people can access it?
Sure. So in 2019, NWG with Bernardo's developed a disrupting exploitation toolkit, but you could only access it if you were a member of the NWG. And it was very much a kind of list, if you like, of legislation and research and things that you could access to help you understand how you might interrupt or disrupt exploitation. And when I joined the organization, I'd used it previously in my previous role, and I wanted it to come to life. I wanted it to be much more user-friendly, less statutory agency kind of focused, so that anyone could access it. So we've been working really hard to make it into a digital format. So it's in the first phase. So we're using a lot of the legislation, the information from the first toolkit, because again, we're not reinventing the wheel here. But what we want to do is convert it into a more user-friendly format. We have launched it already. It was launched on Monday, and you can access it through the resource page of the NWG website. Although you don't have to be a member, you will need to at least register your email address to become a non-member, if you like, because that will help us with the analytics to see who's using it, how often, and where we might need to, sort of focus on a particular area. We are going to have a virtual launch on 15th of July, which will be through Teams. You can get tickets on Eventbrite. They're free, but you will need to register to get access, to get the code to get in. It's an hour and a half from 10 o'clock on the 15th. It will be an opportunity to invite people that have already had a little bit of a go to give us some feedback, the things that are working really well. And we will then be using that to go into the second phase. And within the second phase, we will be sharing a template that people can take away if they've got an example of disruption that they want to go into that. We're going to be collating case examples for a library, if you like, but you will also be able to access those case studies on individual pages. So as an example, one of my amazing colleagues who works in the Community Safety Partnership in Blackpool, he used the community protection warning and notice process really in such an innovative, creative way. So he's done a little video that's embedded into that page, so you can read the legislation, you can have a look at his video. There's a template that he's linked onto that as well, a kind of example letter that you might issue. He is the font of all knowledge when it comes to any antisocial behaviour orders. He's amazing. So in each piece, the civil orders around modern slavery, we've got DC James Rudge, who works for the County Lines Coordination Centre. There's a little clip of him talking about what they are. So what we are going to be doing in the second phase is do more of that. So collecting more examples. The more creative, the more innovative, the better. We don't want to be just about law. We want them to bring in any local initiatives and ideas that have been really helpful to combat exploitation, whether that be around a particular place or space where we know that children and young people are being targeted. It might be, as in West Cornwall, for example, they did a huge campaign where they educated bus drivers, taxi drivers. They put up posters everywhere. So if there's anything going on that you think that would be great to put onto the resource to share, we'd love to hear about it. So that will form part of phase 2, where we start to build it up. And the toolkit is for you, for all of you that are listening. It's your toolkit, it's your resource. So the only way we can make it even more your resource is for you to provide that knowledge, that experience, so that it can grow, and it will be regularly updated. It won't be just something that we put out there that will sit there stagnant. It will be constantly updated and reviewed, and changes of case examples, so that it keeps it fresh, keeps it relevant and informative. So the 15th of July, and I can send you the link, Steve, for people to book on to come to that. So yeah, it's been a busy time.
I'll pop the link for that into the chat. And if anybody's listening to this after the date of that, then don't worry. I will also put in a link to the NWG website and events that you've got taking place. So, and I know there's always loads of things that you're involved in, loads of things you've got going on. So yeah, it's always a really good opportunity. Check it out on the website if you're listening after the 15th of July, and see all the other stuff that's going on, because there will be plenty of it as well.
And if anyone struggles to access the resource, happy for people to contact me, Steve, and I'm happy to do a Teams call and kind of help navigate through it. But it's easy for me to use, and for me to say that, then it should be pretty straight.
Is that something?
I am not tech-minded at all. That was one of my ambitions.
Is that the yardstick? If Lin can use it, anyone can use it.
Absolutely. Yeah. If I can't do it, I have to ask an 8-year-old. So.
Yeah, absolutely. They know everything.
Yeah.
Oh dear. And I'm just thinking, actually, just sort of picking up on some of the other things you've talked about. It's interesting when you talked earlier about the sort of demographic of boys around online sexploitation. And it was interesting, actually, the example you used earlier, where you talked about an example where you were doing that supervision and somebody saying, oh, he's staying with his girlfriend.
Yeah.
The tenancy. And sometimes, actually, if those things are seen the other way around, as in, there's a girl and they're talking about the concerns there and talk about a boyfriend, quite often there's that immediate like, oh, hang on, who's he? How old is he? What's going on? I guess a bit of myth busting, really, in terms of what you see, because sometimes people do have rigid views around particular exploitation. And what sort of some of the common misconceptions that you see around exploitation in terms of who's exploited, what their age range or gender or anything like that? What are some of the sort of really common stuff that you see?
I think the most common, as you've already mentioned, that it's mostly females that are being sexually exploited. That's the kind of common stereotype. We know that generally girls are more likely to be sexually exploited than boys, but that doesn't mean that boys aren't. We still need to think about that. So that's still very much a common stereotype. Again, as you just mentioned, the language that we use when it's a male that's being exploited or abused by a female, you only have to look at headlines. There was one about this time last year with a female teacher who'd actually abused 2 male pupils. And I know it's not necessarily exploitation, but again, it's that stereotype. And I can't remember the organization now, but they picked up straight away. As soon as I saw the headline, I picked up on it. But this individual, who was like a campaigner around misuse of language, was straight in and said, I thought I'd help you out, BBC, with your misspelling of abuse. Because they put something like affair, as opposed to abuse. So
it's so true. I see that all the time. And in fact, I saw it fairly recently. Like I say, it might be in the same case, but also prior to that. And it is always fascinating, like I say, when particularly sometimes around teachers, and like you say, it's extremely different reporting. If it's a male teacher and a younger female pupil, it is very much focused around abuse and abuse of position and sexual abuse. And like you say, actually, when it's the other way around, I've seen so many things of, she was in a relationship with him for 4 years, or, her younger boyfriend.
Yes.
That's always the language you see at the moment, which is really concerning.
Well, I think there is something about gender, but I think there is also something, as you say, about professions and the connection that they have. And, we know that grooming is a connection. It's a relationship. Whichever way you look at it, it is a relationship. Doesn't mean it's a consensual relationship. Often it's a relationship of manipulation. It's a crime of relationship, which is a term that a psychologist called Patrick Tidmarsh does a lot of work around the psychology of the grooming and how that manipulation occurs. And I absolutely agree. It's a relationship of crime. It's a relationship of manipulation. So when we talk about why children and young people might be then coerced into exploiting and abusing other children, again, one of the stereotypes is that, it's choice. It's a lifestyle choice. They're benefiting from it, particularly if you know that child or that young adult it's getting a lot of money, or that they're getting, expensive clothing, whatever. We know that individuals who exploit will use whatever means they can to manipulate, to coerce. We see it in so many aspects of abuse, don't we? Domestic abuse, radicalization, intrafamilial abuse. And sometimes that knowledge that we've taken from all of that learning around domestic abuse, for example, is not transferred. So I still hear comments around lifestyle choice, career criminal, and so that still remains, which is quite worrying as well. It's about reminding, and I've sat in meetings where I've literally had to shout almost at the top of my voice, this is a child we're talking about. And I think the most common age range as well, where it's forgotten that they're children, is that latter adolescent period, from say 15 to 18. The law is really clear. You are a child in law until you're 18. And I know as practitioners, we might not use that term if we're speaking to a child. We wouldn't refer to them because they might feel that that's insulting and it might not help build an appropriate relationship. But we just need to remind each other from time to time as professionals that until they reach the age of 18, in law, they are a child. They cannot consent to being exploited. Regardless of what the benefits are, regardless of what the appearance is, they cannot consent. And the new legislation coming through, the Crime and Policing Bill, very much reflects that and emphasizes that. And even once they turn 18, we know from research from psychologists that the brain doesn't mature into an adult brain at least until the age of 25. And that's a young person who hasn't had any adverse childhood experiences, trauma, etc., etc. We're working with children who have been through often trauma before they've even been exploited, and then they've got all of that to deal with. And I remember going to a conference earlier this year. In fact, it was Child Exploitation Awareness Day, and I was in London, and this speaker came and he said, look, I was exploited as a child. And he showed a photograph of himself when he was a 9-year-old, and he had this beautiful, sweet, lovely, innocent face. And he said, what do you see? And we sort of, well, a child, and smiling at the camera. But he put his hand across the picture and said, look, he's obviously, we knew it was him. He said, look at my eyes. And when you focused on his eyes, such sadness. And he said, what you don't realize, he said, when I was exploited, I was in hell, but what you don't realize is I'd already been to hell, and this was another form of hell. And he said, I didn't have a role model. The person who groomed me, exploited me, became my role model. And that really was just so powerful for us to remember that, that even when a child turns 18, if they've been through that trauma, if they've had adverse trauma prior to exploitation, their ability to really see what's happening in the reality, if you like, that we see it, their reality is going to be very different. And we need to acknowledge that and understand that. And that's not always easy when you've got a 6'3", 16-year-old. Very easy to think of them as an adult when they're using adult language and acting in a very adult way. They're still children, and that can be very tricky.
No, and I think the other really important point you raised there, and I often see it with practitioners I work with, where we talk about choice and consent as we did just then.
Yeah.
And I don't know how you feel about this. There is that sort of phrase around exploitation of it being kind of an exchange of some form or another, a kind of warped exchange, if you like, of the child is always receiving something, whether that's financial or whether it's emotional or sense of belonging, sense of family, whatever it is. And I think that adds an extra layer of complexity for practitioners sometimes to see through that, and again still see them as children and still see it as abuse, even though people say, well, yeah, but they're making money out of it, they're making good money out of it, and they're recruiting other young people, and they're doing this, that, and the other. And it's like, they are, but that is still abuse.
Of course it is.
Do you see that? How do you work with that in terms of those agencies that you work with?
Well, extremely challenging element of that kind of having that mindset. I've been sitting in meetings where I've literally had to be almost raising my voice to be heard, where it's just not sinking in, it's just not being heard. And the voice of the child is so important, and it often gets lost amongst all of the complexity and legislation and the who's going to do what and why haven't they done it, and blaming, not in terms of victim blaming for the child, but also around, well, that agency should have done that person should have done that. We all have a responsibility. We all have a responsibility to call each other out, but in a way that's going to be helpful, and it's going to be very much focused on the child and the family. There is no place for ego or one-upmanship in this type of world. It is very much about reminding ourselves, and that might mean each other from time to time, that, what we might be being presented with can be challenging when you're saying, like I said, a 6'3", 16-year-old, and you're talking about them as a child. But it is about that reminding, and whatever our response is going to be, it must be age appropriate. It must be appropriate to that child. But what does that child need? What does that family need? And sometimes we've reached a point where actually their need was about 5 years ago. And we're at the position we're now because perhaps we didn't acknowledge it, we didn't see it, we didn't respond to it. I know that one of our members, he was telling me about an 11-year-old in his local area. He said he was one of the most prolific criminals in that area at the age of 11. And the question I asked was, well, where were we before he got to the age of 11? Because clearly that's been going on for a very long time. And when you see in the news where a murder has taken place, a child has murdered a child, and you think, oh my gosh, what happened? There must have been signs, there must have been indicators of exploitation. Why didn't we see them? Why didn't we respond? And again, just to kind of link back to the disruption and the interruption element of the work that I'm doing, it's about dispelling myths, stereotypes in the way that we've just talked about, but also we don't need evidence to be at a criminal standard in order to intervene. And one of the things that James Rudge talks about in the slavery trafficking risk order section of the toolkit is about risky acts. and keeping a kind of log of those risky acts. Now, that doesn't mean that we can prove to a criminal standard that a person has exploited whoever, but it puts us in a position where we can do something. We can do something that is going to really interrupt and separate the individuals from each other, because there are serious consequences. So, for instance, with the Modern Slavery Act, whilst those orders, the risk order is a civil order, the consequences of breaching, we're talking 5 years imprisonment. We are talking serious consequences. And the courts are becoming much more aware of these particular orders. We've had them sexual risk orders for harassment, stalking. These orders are not new, but bringing them into the conversation, particularly around modern slavery, when you think, it's 10 years since we've had the Modern Slavery Act, and we're only really just starting to feel confident about using them. The prohibitions that I've seen that have been used have been phenomenal. And I've had practitioners come to me and say, well, police say we can't do anything because there's not enough evidence. And they're giving me a list of risky acts. So I say, right, okay, this is a person you can speak to. This is what you can do. And as soon as you give them that knowledge, they're away. And then they inform others and they share that with others, and we start to see that momentum. So I think one of the things a really big message I'd really like to impart is, don't wait until we've reached a criminal threshold. We don't need to wait till we get to that point. As soon as we start to have a note of, and we become conscious of those activities that would indicate that there's exploitation going on, and that can be from the family, it can be from the school, it can be from a support worker, it could be from anyone at all. Doesn't have to just be evidence that the police gather. We can start to respond in a way that can interrupt and disrupt, because what we don't want is waiting until it's too late and that 16-year-old, 17-year-old is sitting in a youth detention centre. Where did we go wrong? What did we not do before that? And that interruption is so important. It's critical.
Well, Lynn, I can't think of a better way to kind of conclude things from that message, really, of that real takeaway. And I think it's a very important point you make, and actually one that's been echoed in other aspects. And we had the National Child Safeguarding Practice Review Panel recent report around child sexual abuse, interfamilial sexual abuse. And actually one of their key points from that is like you say, that misunderstanding sometimes around the threshold for legal intervention, as in beyond reasonable doubt, as opposed to the threshold for safeguarding, a safeguarding response,
Absolutely.
which is that balance of probabilities, and how often, it may not be meeting that threshold, or may not have the evidence, which we know particularly around child exploitation. It's difficult to get that evidence often. But just because the police are saying we can't do anything, we haven't got the evidence for it, or the CPS are saying this wouldn't go through court, we don't have enough for that, doesn't mean we don't do anything. And actually that opportunity to safeguard children effectively, to prevent it from getting to that stage, where actually it does meet that threshold for criminal involvement and prosecution, which is very, very high. Actually, I think you're right, quite often by that point, I wouldn't say it's too late. I don't think it's ever too late. But
no, I'd like to say that I'm never too late, but I'm saying from a position of where we feel that to be able to have that build that relationship may have gone that step too far, and it may be very difficult to bring them back. It doesn't mean that we lose them and we should ignore them and not care about them, but it may be that we just didn't do enough early enough, really.
And we've lost that opportunity to prevent harm from taking place. I guess, so.
Yeah.
Well, Lynn, thank you so much for you coming in today and sharing your expertise with us, which is so valuable, and the work that the NWG do as a whole. And we talked about the digital toolkit that you've just released. Is there anything else the NWG are working on that you want to make people aware of?
Well, certainly the work that we're doing to empower and support chairs of the multi-agency meetings, we're very much focusing on that this year. And certainly Steve and a number of other colleagues within the organisation are providing shadowing opportunities. We're reviewing, offering those elements of opportunity, really, to think about and reflect on practice. And we're just going to keep looking at trends, finding where the gaps are, that practitioners are saying that they need those gaps to be filled. And wherever we are able to find those, we'll be continuing to offer support in the best way that we possibly can. So, but at the moment, as I said, the kind of key things that are going on are around adolescents post-18, how we can support them effectively, how we can support chairs and those practitioners who are participating in those multi-agency meetings to make them more fruitful and more useful rather than just being a duplication of other meetings, giving them purpose and really finding ways to use them in a really purposeful way. So that's a key part of the work that we're doing at the moment alongside updating resources.
Fantastic. Well, I will put links to all of that into the description for this episode. And like Lin says, do check out the website, do check out the webinar if you're in time for this going out, and do get in touch if you need sort of some advice, some support any point in time, because the NWG are absolutely brilliant at that. So, Lin, thank you so much for your time. It's been amazing speaking to you as always. And if there's anything else that comes along in the future, please get in touch and we'll let everybody know about it as well.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Brilliant. Lovely. Thanks, Lin. Take care. See you later.
Bye.
Bye.
As always, if you'd like to find out more details on the topics discussed in today's episode, including the link to the NWG webinar and website and disruption toolkit, please go to the SSCP website at somerset-safeguardingchildren.org.uk or by following any of the links in this episode description. Now, if you enjoyed listening to P-Pod, we would really appreciate it if you took that time to follow or subscribe to us on your chosen platform, or even better, leave us a review to let other people know about it, and make sure to let your colleagues know about the podcast and encourage them to come and join us here as well. It really does help to spread the word. Now, if you have any questions or comments arising from today's episode, or would like to get involved in future episodes, we would love you to get in touch with us at thepod@somerset.gov.uk. Once again, I'd like to give a huge thank you to my guest today, Lin Sands from the NWG, and of course, I'd like to thank you for listening. My name is Steve Macabee, and I'm the training manager for the Somerset Safeguarding Children Partnership. And I look forward to you joining us again next time at the P-Pod.
Let's work together to help keep children safe.